You can't actually understand what a new story of value might look like. You can't understand actually how to respond to the meta crisis in a way in which we heal a planet drenched in shame. We can't actually restore human dignity unless we can actually understand the following sentence. When I rewrite my story, when I take my unique risk, when I become a unique letter in the cosmic scroll, when I play my unique instrument in the unique self symphony, I reconfigure the music of the divine personhood. Divinity is rewritten. God is rewritten in some way, right? But for real, right? Ontological. And I actually have a direct personal realization and experience of my capacity to actually rewrite divinity. And that actually divinity is waiting desperately to be rewritten, to be evolved by my story. Yeah, we are good. We are good. We are good. Right. So what a crazy delight to be here. And what a pleasure to be here. What a pleasure to be here. And I want to say something about that phrase, what a pleasure to be here. And I want to come back to it because what a pleasure to be here. I'm writing it down, could mean, many different things. So I want to just take a second before we read the code and just kind of locate where we are. And then do our second week talking about story. And we're putting together now a draft of what we might call a pastiche, right? It's not quite a book. It's not quite a section of essays. It's more like fragments, like there's pre-Socratic fragments. So fragments on story, on telling the story of story, on reclaiming story and its nature as the ontology of cosmos, meaning as the very structural nature of cosmos. And you might say, really? Well, why does that matter? And of course, it matters inexorably and unimaginably and ineluctably. And if I could think of like 4 more words that match that, I would add them on, but none come to mind right now. But it matters enormously, right? Ginormously, right? It's of enormous significance because the realization that story is real is what tells me that my story is personally implicated in the evolutionary story. The realization that story is real tells me that my story is personally implicated in the cosmic story, and that there's no detail of my story that is alienated from cosmic magnificence. So I want to try and unpack the second week of story, and David's going to resonate our code in a couple of minutes. And I did that rare act, and I thank you, Lena, for sending to me, if it was even a tad early. I did that rare act of carefully during the same week of One Mountain reading the beautiful text that Lena prepared to review myself what we said last week. And of course, we got to review it again in a different context with the Dharma recapitulation, which is always, elegantly and beautifully done by Christina Amlon, which is precise quotes. It's precise phrases that are woven together in a somewhat new order, right? In order to kind of transmit a second time a week later, the essential new dimension of the great new story of value in response to the meta crisis that we were trying to unpack that week. So let me just step back. That was just a brief hello, and that hello made a lot of sense to people who have been here before. If you've never been here before, you're like, oh my God, how did I wind up in the middle of an insider game of baseball, and what is going on here? Okay, so let me just back up a minute or two. okay, and just kind of set the stage. We're going to be very precise in terms of time today. It's 1:16. We're going to finish exactly at 2 minutes to 2. But it's always worthwhile to set the stage. Let's set the stage, okay? All right, so we're at a time between worlds. We're at a time between stories. Zach likes to call it a time between worlds. It's a phrase that he uses. I call it a time between stories. And since we're creating together, we're at a time between worlds. We're at a time between stories. Between stories means that every time is enacted by a story. And within a period of time, for example, today on the planet, there's a number of stories that are happening at the same time. Stories can become inaccurate. Stories can become distorted. Stories can become stories of power, as Foucault spent a lot of time pointing out. Stories can become just stories. Stories can become, right? Stories can be taken seriously, but we actually realize that they're just power drives and they're just power grabs and they're merely contrived and they're fictions or figments of our imagination or mere social constructs, and they don't actually point to anything real at all. That can be true about stories, right? That's the postmodern insight about many stories, and that's partially true. But underneath stories that have lost their plot line, stories that are hiding baser motives of dominator power drives and other forms of pathology, underneath those, there's this deeper story. There's this deeper storyline. There's this deeper plot line of cosmos. And that's what we call a story of value. And that story of value actually is what creates the generation. And if you're new to One Mountain, and I hope we just put in every week our kind of love or die text, which we're meant to put in every week so that new people can read it and have it, right? But if you're new to One Mountain, I would say in a word, we are deeply aware of the meta crisis. I've been writing about the meta crisis since 2009, 10, 11, right? Quite intensely. And the meta crisis is the realization that we have crossed planetary boundaries in terms of the exterior substrates of reality, that we don't have principles to create interior coherence and coordination to respond to the crisis, and that the natural path of reality right now will devolve, and that devolution will bring us to either a collapse of humanity itself, right? Think about passenger pigeons, right, that dominated the American plain in the mid-19th century and have since disappeared, right? Human beings will actually disappear. It will be the next great extinction, right? The death of humanity. Or, in an equally possibility, the death of our humanity. We'll enter into a kind of world totalitarian state run by artificial general intelligence, in which human freedom and human dignity and the human experience of being welcome in the cosmos and human creativity and the drama of human decision-making will be effectively and benignly effaced by the smiling, indifferent face of a totalitarian planetary stack from which there will be no escape. And that is not a dystopian nightmare. That is actually, I believe, the incremental path that we are on right now, and we're not that many minutes before midnight. So those are these two paths, and what we're saying here in One Mountain is that we don't need to deny that reality. Denial, right, is an effacing of our dignity and leads to disaster. And yet we don't need to be doomers. We don't need to embrace that as inevitable and inexorable, right? There's actually a third possibility. That third possibility is the dawn of a new era, right? We call it the fourth Big Bang. The fourth Big Bang meaning after the first Big Bang, no thing to matter. And then the second Big Bang, matter to life. And the third Big Bang, life to the depth of the self-reflective human mind. We call that the three Big Bangs. right, of reality, from the physiosphere to the biosphere to the noosphere, in the words of the Russian cosmist, call it the noosphere, the world of culture. But the world of culture of Homo sapien won't go on forever. The Homo sapien world won't go on forever. We've actually hit a point that we've crossed planetary boundaries, both physically in the exterior, but we've also crossed the planetary boundary of dissolution in interiors, where we're left without anchor, we're left without North Stars, we're left without direction. We're left without a field of value, without a field of meaning. And the response to this moment, in terms of being able to literally change the trajectory of the future, right? To invite in the future that wants to be born, right? The most beautiful world that we can possibly imagine, the most good world we can possibly imagine, the most true world we can possibly imagine. And the way to do that, the source code move, the ninja move, right? That which takes down the Death Star and explodes reality into a new possibility. The Death Star in Star Wars being the culture of death, right? The direct hit on the Death Star, right, is, and Claire, you and I have talked about this in depth in the movie that we made together, right? What takes down the Death Star, this direct hit, is the ability to tell a new story of value. And we're here to tell that new story of value. That's what we're here to do. And we're telling it every week, and we're telling it at mystery schools, and we're engaged together and crossing over to the other side. And in some sense, the entire project, right, of the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, which I was very privileged to found together with my dear friend Ken Wilber, with Sally Kempton, Lori Galperin, right, is this is the crossing. This is the crossing. We're here to do the crossing. And the crossing is, am I willing to cross over in this lifetime and to actually move from being Homo sapien, right, to actually becoming, incarnating, being the new human, the new humanity, meaning living from, generating reality from this new story of value. And if we generate reality from this new story of value, not as one person or two people, right, not as an elite that is imposing a reality structure on the majority, but actually, if we actually tell a new story of value that we all actually recognize, we root it in the sciences, in the exterior sciences, we root it in the interior sciences, we actually recognize it as true in our deepest interiors, and we begin to live from it, and it spreads like a virus, or like a positive and wondrous virus, then what happens is, right, an entirely new expression of reality emerges, an entirely new human emerges, and a new humanity emerges. And we begin to birth a planetary awakening in love through unique self symphonies, right? A kind of upgrading of what my dear friend Barbara used to call the planetary Pentecost, right? The planetary Pentecost is a Christian term, but it's actually a deeper vision. It's beyond a Christian or Islam or Jewish or secular or Buddhist or Kashmir Shaivist, Hindu, right? It's actually a planetary awakening in love, because we birthed a new human and new humanity. The very core of birthing a new human and a new humanity, right, is to tell a new story of value. Does that make sense, everyone, so far? Right? And now, why am I retelling this? Okay, so you might say, why is he retelling this, right? I can hear some voices like, we know this. So why is he telling this again? I said, I'm not telling this to you again. I'm not reminding you, right? I'm not remanding you, anybody. Does everyone get that? This is not for you. I'm just not for you. This is for me. Okay? Right? I tell myself this story 4 times a day. I tell myself this story every week, right? I perform the story and sharing it with myself, and I'm sharing it with you. You can't just have that story in memory, right? To actually become the new human and the new humanity, I tell the story every day. Do you get that? If I don't tell the story every day, I become alienated from the story. So what we do here at One Mountain is we're here together to tell this new story of value, right? And this new story of value is about the 4 selves, right? It's about a new vision of relationships. It's about a new vision of Eros. It's about the tenets of intimacy, right? Right. But this is the, and it's rooted in a new theory of value, and it's rooted in a set of first principles and first values. And there's a book called First Principles and First Values that I invite you to read. There's another book called Return to Eros. I invite you to read. Another book called Your Unique Self. I invite you to read. Start there, right? And we're birthing this great library, and we're birthing this set of events where we come together and we be the new human and the new humanity. And my dear friend Barbara Marx Hubbard and I, together with all of you, we created this place to be in order to have this evolutionary church, synagogue, secular humanist center, gathering, whatever we are, this one mountain, many paths, be this seat of revolution. And the revolution is the telling of the new story. And in this telling of the new story, we want to weave together the fragments of validated truth, the fragments of validated truth from all the disciplines in the ancient world and the traditional world, ancient, traditional, kind of pre-modern, right? Then the modern world, then the importance of the postmodern insights. We want to weave all those together into a new story of value that you can tell anywhere in the world, that is based on a woven together set of pearls, which are based on validated insights, that when you weave them together, they create a radical new whole, greater than the sum of any of the parts, which is the new story of value, which then becomes the bottom-up, self-organizing, self-actualizing new language of cosmos. So we have to lay down new fields of language. And then this new language self-actualizes a new reality. It's a bottom-up system. There's a new set of simple first rules and first principles that actually generate a new reality. So I'm telling you this story, and thank you for listening. And I'm telling myself this story, right? And so for those of you who are kind of saying, "Oh, right, I know this already. Why? I know this information." And I have a couple of my closest friends and students and colleagues who I start telling this, their eyes glaze over and they start thinking about other things. "Oh, we know this already." No, we don't. We don't, right? If we're going to do something real, we have to become the new story. Okay? And so what we're doing in these couple of weeks is we're actually dealing with one piece of the new story, which is the nature of story itself. Does that make sense? So we're dealing with one piece of the new story, right? And last week and this week, and we've done it in a number of other one mountains, and we're going to put it together in a kind of a presented volume of a certain kind. But we're actually telling the nature, talking about the nature of story itself. That's where we are. And so we spent last week, right, going through kind of unpacking the nature of story. And we showed that story, right, is a quality of cosmos. Story is the very core of cosmos itself. Cosmos itself, right, is a story. And story is not a human creation, right? Reality is a story, right? I'm writing some notes to myself. Reality is a story kind of all the way up and all the way down. That's its nature. And we went through what the dimensions of story were in, and here's where I'm tempted to kind of repeat all of last week, so I won't do. So I want to just invite anyone, right, anyone who's kind of new this week, go back and listen to last week afterwards. Listen to last week and this week together. So I want to go now part 2. And if you weren't here last week, that's fine. You'll be able to pick up in the middle. Okay? Okay? So David's going to read the code. Okay, then we're going to kind of dive in for like 24 minutes, right? 25 minutes. And we're going to try and take this discussion on story, right, the next step. David, give us the code and we'll dive in. Okay, this is a crazy important, crazy exciting week. David, take us inside. Again, read it to us twice so we can feel it and like just blow us open. And then we're going to go like all the way deep inside. So great. So great.
All right, here we go. Welcome, everyone. So this is a consolidation of the Dharma, the teaching today. So here it is. This week's Evolutionary Love Code. The universe is not merely a fact. It is a story. Not an ordinary story, a love story. Not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story. And your story is a chapter in the evolutionary love story. To know my life is a story is to know that the story must be performed. There are 3 levels of relationship to performance, and particularly to the performance of our story. Level 1, pre-tragic performance. Level 2 is when we meet the tragic and stop performing. Level 3 is the post-tragic, in which we reclaim both the dignity and the divinity of our performance. So here it is again. This week's Evolutionary Love Code. The universe is not merely a fact, it is a story. Not an ordinary story, a love story. not an ordinary love story, but an evolutionary love story. And your story, my story, is a chapter in the evolutionary love story. To know my life is a story is to know that the story must be performed. There are 3 levels of relationship to performance, and particularly to the performance of our story. Level 1, pre-tragic performance. Level 2 is when we meet the tragic and we stop performing. At level 3, it's when we meet the post-tragic and we claim both the dignity and the divinity of our performance. It's with that, I turn my word back to you, beloved Dr. Marc.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Okay, so here we go. Okay, we ready? And thank you. Just thank you for just bearing with us in kind of framing of the introduction. And I completely get, right? I get those of you who are program directors and think that's extra. We know that. And that would be true if we were doing Wisdotainment, if we're trying to do a popular blog, right? We're trying to kind of just, right? But we're not doing Wisdotainment. We're trying to gather a group of us who are revolutionaries, evolutionaries, who are, we're reenacting, if you will, the Florentine Platonic Academy, right? And in some sense, you know, I often say we're Da Vinci and we're Marcello Facinio, right? But we're actually more Marcello Facinio than Da Vinci for lots of reasons. And Marcello Facinio, who runs the Florentine Platonic Academy, is actually a student of Platon. And Platon is a Byzantine scholar of antiquities, Greco-Roman world, some paganism, who tries to integrate Plato and Aristotle. And he has this vision of a universal field of value. And he comes to Florence, he talks to Cosmo de Medici, and that out of those conversations, the Florentine Platonic Academy is created, which births modernity. And so in some deep sense, that creation and that time between worlds, that time between stories and Florence, birthed all the dignities of modernity. You know, and as I've said many times before, to the extent they got the plot lines right in the Renaissance, the beauty and dignity of modernity was birthed. But to the extent they got key plot lines wrong, modernity went off course. Evolution didn't keep growing. Evolution began to meander. Evolution took some very, very painful side roads, and something of the thread of the story was lost. And Kafka, right, the great writer Kafka, Franz Kafka, right, he basically is the person who picks up in late modernity the sense that we've lost the plot line. When you read Kafka's Trial, it's the story. Kafka's Trial is the story of this protagonist K, right, who's lost the plot line. And he can't find the plot line of his own story. He doesn't understand how things relate to each other. The whole notion of there being a coherent story is lost. And that's really what Kafka's writing about. He's writing about, right, the loss of a plot line. So Shakespeare, every once in a while, has a moment where he feels the lost plot line, and you feel that figure in Shakespeare, that sense that there might be, we might have lost the thread. Maybe there's no thread, or have we lost the thread? And then Shakespeare kind of moves to other voices. Kafka picks up that realization of a loss of story. We've lost Ariadne's thread. We went to slay the Minotaur, right, as Theseus did, right, in the great myth, right? We created the Industrial Revolution, we created the scientific method, but then we got lost in the labyrinth, and we lost our relationship to Eros, Ariadne, and her thread, which would lead us out of the labyrinth. Right? That's the tragedy of this moment. We've lost the storyline. That's what Kafka's talking about. But it's not just a lost storyline. It's when a particular dimension of the storyline is either twisted, distorted, goes in the wrong direction, or is just read out of the story. And what was read out of the story was value itself, right? That actually we're following a North Star, and that North Star is value. We're going somewhere. And that there are actually a set of first principles and first values that are the plot lines of the story, and that story actually lives inside of us. We recognize that story. We know that story because it actually lives in us. And that story itself is one of the core values of Cosmos, right? So if there's we've talked about 17, 18 first principles and first values of Cosmos, and that appears in the First Principles and First Values book. And I really invite everyone as kind of a core kind of background text, right, to this One Mountain, Many Paths, right, to our revolutionary undertaking, to our subversive undertaking. That's kind of a core text. So we outline there kind of 17, 18 First Principles and First Values, which are these plot lines of story. So what we're trying to do is reanimate the plot line. We're trying to get the thread back. We're trying to find our North Star. Now, in these First Principles and First Values, right, one of them is story itself, right? Is that story is, as we said all last week, and we said already today, is an ontology of Cosmos, meaning it's for real. Now, the fancy way to say that is that phenomenology is ontology, which means phenomenology, the depth pattern of my own experience, is what I would call phenomenology. There's a whole debate of what phenomenology means. Let's skip that for a second. My friend Daniel Abrams, in a 2009 academic article, wrote extensively, right, about our mutual colleague Moshe Idel's use of the word phenomenology. Skip that. Press delete. Phenomenology means the recursive, recurrent pattern of my own deepest experience of my own experience. That's phenomenology. So phenomenology is ontology. Okay, what does that mean? That means that the mysteries are within us, that my own deepest experience tells me something about the nature of reality. Because my own deepest experience participates in the field of value. I live in a field of value. Value is real. And the field of value lives in me. So that which lives in me most strongly, and now we're starting, Lena, this is really starts part 2. So the value that lives in me most apparently and strongly before anything else, right, is twofold. One value is, right, my story. I'm always thinking about my story. Again, not because I am a narcissist, but because I'm eavesdropping on a current of divine conversation, which is itself thinking about my story. My storyline matters. So I call that, I want to call that, we call that in cosmologic humanism together, we call that my sacred autobiography. And in a book called Soul Prints, right, in the 4th section of Soul Prints, there's a section called Live Your Story, as a kind of command, an injunction, a kind of categorical imperative reality of a reality. Live your story, meaning live your sacred autobiography. Meaning your letter, my letter in the cosmic scroll. And notice we're using the image of language. Language is the code of reality, right? My letter in the cosmic scroll, which is my story, is its own unique code that was intended by reality. It's a unique piece of code written, intended by reality, encrypted in my experience. In other words, a unique dimension of the story of reality is encrypted in my flesh. We are messengers. We're carrying code, but we're messengers that have forgotten our message, and so we've forgotten that we are the code. And the code is my story, and my story matters. And by the way, the last 100 years of work in the Western world on trauma and recovering, right, from the voices of trauma and healing, right, the past patterns of my story is part of a recognition and a disclosure that my story matters. And the weakness of the trauma movement is that it focuses only on one part of my story, which is the past, which is only one part of my story. You know, and the Enlightenment teachers focus on another part of my story, which is the present, right? The eternal now, which explodes, right? The movement of story. The story disappears. The story becomes the disappearance of story. The goal of my personal story is to disappear story for the Enlightenment teachers. And that's also part of my story. But then there's a third part of the story, which is the future, my future story, where I'm going, my deepest heart's desire, right? My unique gifts, because my irreducible uniqueness doesn't get exploded in the now. And my irreducible uniqueness is not defined by the past. My irreducible uniqueness, moves towards, reaches for a memory of the future, and it has unique gifts to give, and unique poems to write, and unique paintings to paint, and unique breaths to take, and unique relationships to have, and unique transformations to transform. Right? So there's this realization that my story matters, right? Through the prism of my story, I'm personally implicated in the cosmic story. And the cosmic story is incomplete without my story. So that's a very big realization because, and how do I know that? Well, I know that for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because phenomenology is ontology, right? Because story is a value that lives inside of me. And I'm not tracing and always trying to understand the nature of my story because I'm pathological. No. Mythologize, don't pathologize. Don't reduce your deepest experience to pathology. Actually understand that your deepest experience at least points towards your mythic life. And your life is mythic because your life is holding chapter and verse, right, in the universal love story. In other words, when I actually live my story, I become the intimate universe in person. I become the cosmoerotic universe in person. So that's the beginning. So one, let's go slow. One is, right, I am the story, right? As I'm a primary actor in the story. That's number one. That's one, okay? Two, I want to move from an unconscious to a conscious story. And as I can be the primary actor in my story, but not realize it, I can think that my story is simply personal, that my story is simply psychological, that my story is simply communal in a tribal sense, or in a clan sense, or in a corporate sense, or in a neighborhood sense, or in a religious sense. No, although those all might be true, my story is cosmic, right? My story is not alienated. No detail of my story is alienated from cosmic magnificence. Every detail of my story matters, and my paying attention to details is not neurosis, although it can be. I can be involved in recursive loops of story that I should move beyond, right? There's definitely, I need to bracket dimensions and move beyond them. But deeper than the bracket, I actually disclose in the details of my story my directional singles, my orienting North Stars, right? I begin to understand the tidbits of telos, which are the telltale signs, right, that awaken me from my torporitic slumber and point me towards my destiny. And I realize that the path itself is part of my destination, and how I walk and how I live the story actually changes cosmos itself. Cosmos is reformulated. Cosmos is reconfigured, right, by how I live my story. So one is I am the story. I am the story. I am the story in person. Two is I am the universal love story in person. In other words, my personal story, it's not just the personal is political. We said the personal is cosmic. My personal story is chapter and verse in the universal love story. Two. Three, right, that has to become conscious. I move from unconscious story to conscious story. Right? I'm aware of the fact that I am the universal love story in person. Right? That's three. Four, I'm the storyteller. So I'm responsible not just to live my story, but to tell my story. I've got to tell my story. My story deserves to be told. Until the stories, this is Laura Writing writes, until the stories of our lives are told, we go on desperately craving it. We have to tell our story, and we have to give dignity to our story. That's number four. And I think I've shared with you before, one of the most upsetting columns I ever read was by William Safire, right, who was a brilliant thinker who was quite aware of his brilliance, thought much of himself, and partially deservedly so. But he really kind of missed the point in it, when he kind of writes, something like, why are all these people writing autobiographies when they really have nothing to say? And in Anthony Storr, cites this column in his book on self, The British Psychoanalyst, right? And of course, Safire has this notion, and he actually he writes this implicitly, Safire, and Anthony Storr himself writes about the indignity of having common people write, autobiographies. And Safire writes a book called Great Speeches in History, which are all speeches by famous men and women. And both satire and store, right, actually are an affront to human dignity. That actually every human being, right, has a story that's worthy of telling, and that needs to be told, right, that has dignity, that needs to be acted out on stage. Right? It's not just the biopic of, right, the famous singer or sports star that deserves to be told. Every human being has a story that's filled with dignity and filled with beauty and filled with ontological gravitas. It's got gravitas, right? We live in the unbearable gravitas of being, not the unbearable lightness of being. And that story deserves to be told. Every story. Every human being has an autobiography which is worthy of the pages. And every human being's autobiography is a sacred autobiography, right? Is a letter in the cosmic scroll. So that's number 4. So my story deserves to be told. My story has dignity. Number 5, my story deserves to be performed. Does that make sense? My story deserves to be performed. I have to perform my story. The whole world is a stage, right? And the whole world is a stage, meaning I have to perform my story, meaning I show up at Cirque du Soleil as a performer with the best of myself, and I elicit the most stunning and beautiful dimensions of myself. We have pseudo performances. People dress up for the ball, and we make fun of the ball, as in the story of Cinderella, right? But even Cinderella wants to dress up for the ball. So although there's pomposity at the ball, there's falseness at the ball, but underneath the pomposity, underneath the falseness, there's the sense that life is a performance. You know, as it's 2024, when we're doing this particular teaching, and in the world of Netflix, there's a series called Bridgerton that many people are watching, and it's a contrived reality which is about the performance of courtship, right? This court with this imaginary fictional queen, right, who's this complex figure, and there's a hidden love story between her and her husband, and all of Bridgerton's about love stories, and it's about the performance of the love story. So on the one hand, in Bridgerton on the Ton, right, in this particular class, there's much to be mocked in story, and there's a Lady Whistledown who kind of mocks what's going on, and she becomes this voice that mocks the story, but even she understands that the story actually matters, that the story has to be performed, right? And so though we can perform a story in a way that violates our authenticity, or we can perform, right, the love story of our lives in a way that elicits our authenticity. And of course, Bridgerton is this, incredibly, shockingly elite, story about, the elite, wealthy upper class, right, who have the spare time, right, to enact their stories. But of course, we have to democratize Bridgerton, right? The democratization of Bridgerton is that everyone has the capacity to live those stories, right, and to play out, right, their great love story, right? So we have to perform. That's number 5. We have to perform our story in a post-tragic sense. We have to realize that my love story is cosmic Eros performed, right, in the personal details of my life, right? That the drama of my life is the stage for cosmic Eros uniquely performed in me. And there are no repeat performances, and every performance is unique, and every performance was intended by Cosmos, and Cosmos spend decades and centuries and eons, right, putting together the set necessary for every particular performance. That's number 5. I've got to perform my story, and the performance of my story is worthy, it's dignified, it's desired by Cosmos, it's needed by Cosmos. The performance of my story is the intention of me being alive. And that's when I begin to realize I'm welcome in Cosmos. I'm welcome. My story has dignity. My story matters in some ultimate sense. Okay? So that's number kind of 5. I perform my story, right? And number 6, that my story has dignity. My story is welcome. My story is intended by Cosmos. Cosmos needs my story. The story of Cosmos is somehow incomplete without my story. So that's number 6, right? Number 7, I'm not performing a fixed script. There's not a fixed script. The story is unfolding. The story both of Cosmos, all of Cosmos, the story of humanity, and then my human story. So Cosmos, humanity, my particular human story, that set of nested Russian dolls. We just did 3 Russian nested dolls, the cosmic story, right? The kind of human story, and then my personal story within that human story, right? That story itself is unfinished. And so I'm not only a primary actor in the story, I'm not only the storyteller, I'm not only the performer of the story, but I'm the playwright. And that's number 7. I'm the playwright. I'm writing the story. I'm actually writing the next chapter of the story. The story is unfinished. And I am co-authoring this story with the universe. I'm a co-author, right, of the story of my life with the universe. I'm not the single author. I didn't decide where to be born or when to be born or to whom to be born and with what proclivities to be born, with what genetic structure to be born, with what interior potentialities to be born. I didn't decide any of that. So I'm not the single author of the story. It's not quite my life. That's not quite right. But I am a co-author in the story. And I have freedom, this unimaginable freedom to participate in writing the next chapter. Okay, so that's number 7. Right? Number 7 is that it's an unfinished story. And number 8, and we're going to spend all of next week on this, but number 8, how I write that next chapter in the story, the lines that I pen, the plot line that I unfold has cosmic significance, meaning it doesn't just affect my story, but it quite literally ripples throughout reality. What I do and how I do it and who I decide to become within the context and constraints and potentialities of my unique circumstance, but that window of choice, that point of choice that I have, in which I take my unique risk and live my unique story, my unique sacred autobiography, and give my unique gift into my unique circle of intimacy and influence. I become this unique quality of intimacy. I incarnate my unique set of allurements. I be the unique desire that courses in me, and I liberate myself from surface scripts of desire, and I identify my unique script of desire, right? My letter in the cosmic scroll, my deepest heart's desire. To the extent that I do that, I not only fulfill the purpose of my existence, but I rewrite the cosmic tale. There's a way in which my instrument in the unique self symphony, and we've moved from the image, we just moved from the image of writing to the image of music. So allow me to be in that space in between them, right? My letter in the cosmic scroll, my note, the melody, the music that I play in the unique self symphony changes the quality of the entire symphony and resets the direction of cosmos itself. Wow. And that's not set, right? That's number 8. And I want to add something to this, is let's call this 8A, right? That's not set merely by public happenings. It's not set just by the public events of my life, right? It's set by the private moments, the hidden moments, right? The texts, right? The understandings, right? The moment in which, right, I decide, right, no, I'm not a princess, I'm a queen. I'm not a prince, I'm a king, right? And a new quality of intimacy is created, right? right? And Krishna meets Radha, and a new world is birthed, right? And I become something that's unimaginable, that's unbearable in its unique beauty. But I can only become that through my unique risk, and my unique risk is generally not played out in the public. It generally is deeper than that which I can easily explain to almost everyone in my life. It's this unique, deep, interior moment where I risk my very existence in order to be born, in order to exist. And reality demands that. It demands the passion of that unique risk. You know, I don't know quite how to say this, but there's this moment, or these series of moments, in which I show up so entirely and I become fearless. Right? I was reading, fragments a few weeks ago, pieces, not really fragments, pieces from Hannah Arendt's doctoral thesis, which is about Augustine's theory of love, right? And, Arendt writes this, when she's, still passionately in love with Heidegger. Her love letters to Heidegger were published. That didn't go well. It's never good when your beloved turns out to be a Nazi. That's a problem. So that was a problem. But Hannah Arendt writes very beautifully about how all love is conditional, right? And conditional in the sense that we can't really live the love because we're afraid to lose it. And she says the true love, right, is the place where I step so fully into the moment for its own sake that I become completely fearless. Right? The moment is so self-justifying, so filling, so full that fear falls away, and I just am, and I'm loving for its own sake. Right? That's where my unique risk comes from. My unique risk comes from this place that I so love the world, and I know that the world so desperately needs me, that I'm willing to step in and live fully, right, in a joy that's unimaginable, in a trembling, right, that's unbearable, right, and in a goodness that's undeniable. Right? That's the unique risk in which I begin to live this new chapter in the story. And that story rewrites not only my autobiography, but God's autobiography. And that's what I'm going to pick up next week. What does it mean that we rewrite God's autobiography? Right? It's much more dramatic. It's not poetry. You can't actually understand the Renaissance. You can't actually understand Renaissance humanism. You can't actually understand what a new story of value might look like. You can't understand actually how to respond to the meta crisis in a way in which we heal a planet drenched in shame. We can't actually restore human dignity unless we can actually understand the following sentence. And with this, we end right now. Right? That actually, when I rewrite my story, when I take my unique risk, when I become a unique letter in the cosmic scroll, when I play my unique instrument in the unique self symphony, I reconfigure the music of the divine personhood. Divinity is rewritten. God is rewritten in some way, right? But for real, right? Ontologically. And I actually have a direct personal realization and experience of my capacity to actually rewrite divinity. And that actually divinity is waiting desperately to be rewritten, to be evolved by my story. And that's the piece we're going to pick up on next week. So, wow.